I already told you this is my house. You don't get to barge in here waving a camera at me.
Keep your hands where I can see them. We're here because someone called for help.
Help? There's not. Look, you're blowing this out of proportion.
It's all being recorded.
I need you to step back and lower your voice.
Wait, you're filming? No, you can't.
I didn't do anything.
Hands where I can see them right now.
Okay, all right.
The night was cold and very quiet at the Vance estate. Deep inside the large house, Ilara lay in her bed. Every breath felt like a struggle against the cancer that was slowly taking her strength. For months, this room had been her whole world, but it was not a place of rest. It was a prison. Her husband, Alistair, had made sure of that. He had taken her phone and told the doctors he was the only one who could care for her. He acted like a hero to the neighbors, but when the doors were shut, his voice turned sharp and mean. Tonight, the air felt different. Alistair had been more angry than usual. He had shouted at her for being a burden and threatened her until she could barely stop shaking. He thought she was too weak to do anything about it. But Ilara had one last bit of strength left. Earlier that day, she had hidden a small device near her pillow. It was silent and invisible, but it was listening. It was recording every cruel word and every threat he made. As Alistair finally left the room and the house grew still, Ilara knew this was her only chance. She couldn't wait for morning. If she stayed here one more night, she was afraid she might never leave. With shaking hands, she reached for her walker. It was heavy, and her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to stand. Every inch she moved felt like a mile. She crawled toward the door, her heart thumping loudly in her chest. She reached the hallway and headed for the front door. The house felt huge and scary in the dark. Finally, she felt the cool air from the entrance. She saw the lights of an ambulance in the driveway. She had managed to call for help when Alistair wasn't looking. As the medics ran toward her, Ilara collapsed into their arms. "I need help," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, just help me out." She was leaving the old money life behind, but she was carrying the truth with her. The recording was still running, capturing the first moments of her escape. Alistair's secrets were no longer safe. Alistair Vance did not look like a man who had anything to hide. When the police arrived at the massive estate the next morning, he met them at the door with a calm and polished smile. He was dressed in an expensive sweater, looking every bit like the successful man the town admired. He welcomed the officers into the grand hallway, his voice smooth and steady as he began his defense. He told the officers that he was a trained caregiver who had dedicated his life to his wife. He spoke about Ilara's illness with a sad shake of his head, acting as if he were a hero who had sacrificed everything to keep her safe. He claimed that Ilara was confused because of her medication and that her escape the night before was just a result of her declining health. Alistair painted a picture of a devoted husband who was simply doing his best under impossible circumstances. As he walked the officers through the beautiful rooms, he pointed out the medical equipment he had bought for her. He acted like he had nothing to fear, believing that his money and his high status would protect him from any questions. He spoke with such confidence that it was hard to believe he could be the man from the recording. However, while Alistair stood there in his perfect house, he didn't realize that the police had already heard the truth. His polished words were being measured against the raw terror in Ilara's voice, and for the first time in his life, his old money charm was not going to be enough. The police started to look deeper into the history of Alistair and Ilara. They found that the trouble did not start with her illness. It went all the way back to 2020, long before the cancer had made her so weak. At that time, they were living in a beautiful home with shiny marble floors. To everyone else, they looked like the perfect old money couple, but behind closed doors, the first signs of Alistair's anger were showing. One afternoon, a loud noise came from the hallway. Ilara had fallen hard onto the cold floor. When someone asked what happened, Alistair was quick to speak for her. He claimed she had just slipped because she was clumsy. But Ilara knew the truth. She hadn't slipped, he had pushed her during an argument. When she tried to stand up for herself, Alistair told her she had a listening problem. He said that if he had actually hit her, she would have broken a bone. This was the first slip, the moment the power in their marriage changed. Alistair realized he could hurt her and then use his charm to make people believe it was an accident. He began to use his words to make her feel small and unimportant. He told her that she was lippy and that she needed to learn her place. Ilara started to feel like she was walking on eggshells in her own home. She didn't know it yet, but this one push was just the beginning of a long and dark path. The marble floors were beautiful, but they hid the first drops of a secret battle that would eventually lead to the recording she would one day hide under her pillow. As Ilara's health grew worse, the medical appointments became more frequent. Alistair always insisted on being the only person to speak with her doctors. He used his charm to make the medical staff believe he was a perfect, caring husband, but behind the scenes, he was using her illness to control her even more. Whenever Ilara tried to explain her pain or the strange bruises appearing on her body, Alistair would quickly interrupt her. He began a pattern of medical gaslighting, telling the doctors that Ilara was just confused or that her symptoms were not as bad as she claimed. When a doctor noticed dark marks on her skin and asked where they came from, Alistair was ready with a lie. He told the medical team, "It's just her platelets," claiming that her low blood counts from the cancer treatments made her bruise easily. He made it sound like a simple medical fact, and because he acted so professional, the doctors often believed him. Inside their home, he used these same lies to break Ilara's spirit. He told her that she was lazy and that her pain wasn't real. He convinced her that no one else would want to take care of her because she was such a burden. By blaming everything on her illness, he made Ilara feel like she couldn't trust her own body or her own mind. This was a quiet kind of torture. It allowed Alistair to hide his violence in plain sight, using the very cancer she was fighting as a cover for the way he was hurting her. Ilara felt more alone than ever, trapped in a world where the man supposed to protect her was actually the one making sure she stayed weak and silenced. Alistair's control grew even tighter within the wound care chamber, a room that was supposed to be for healing but became a place of lessons in pain. He used his military-grade medical training not to comfort Ilara, but to show her exactly who was in charge. When it was time to change her bandages or clean her surgical sites, Alistair would intentionally be rough, ignoring her cries of pain. He told her that her suffering was a lesson she needed to learn because she wasn't being grateful enough for his help. He often reminded her that he was the only one willing to do this disgusting work. While he cleaned her wounds, he would whisper insults, calling her repulsive and telling her that no nurse or doctor would ever want to touch her. If Ilara flinched or asked him to be more careful, Alistair would stop the care entirely, leaving her in a state of neglect for hours as a punishment. He wanted her to believe that her survival depended completely on his mercy. This room became a place of deep fear for Ilara. The very treatments she needed to stay alive were turned into moments of torture. Alistair enjoyed the power he had over her vulnerable body, using the caregiver facade to hide his cruelty from the world. Outside the room, he was the devoted husband; inside, he was a cold master who used pain to ensure Ilara remained silent and broken. She began to realize that Alistair wasn't trying to help her get better, he was trying to make sure she was too terrified to ever speak up against him. Alistair knew that if anyone from the outside world saw how he treated Ilara, his perfect husband image would be ruined. To keep his secret safe, he began to slowly cut her off from everyone she knew. He told her family and friends that she was too tired to talk or that her doctors had ordered her to have total peace and quiet. He became the gatekeeper of her life, making sure that every phone call or message went through him first. Eventually, he took her phone away entirely. He told her it was for her own good because the screen light was bad for her headaches, but the real reason was to leave her with no way to call for help. Without her phone, Ilara was trapped in the huge house with only Alistair's voice for company. He used this silence to fill her head with lies, telling her that her friends had stopped asking about her and that her family had moved on with their lives. He wanted her to believe that he was the only person left in the world who cared about her. This isolation made Ilara feel small and forgotten, which was exactly what Alistair wanted. He knew that a person who feels alone is much easier to control. By cutting the strings that tied her to the outside world, he turned the Vance estate into a place where his word was the only law. Ilara sat by the window for hours, watching the world go by, wondering if anyone knew she was still alive inside that beautiful prison. She felt like a ghost in her own home, silenced by the man who claimed to love her the most. Even though she was alone and had no phone, Ilara refused to give up. She knew that if she ever got out, she would need proof of what was happening behind the closed doors of the estate. She began to look for a way to record Alistair when he thought no one was listening. She remembered a small, old recording device she had used for her medical notes long ago. It was small enough to hide, and Alistair had forgotten it even existed. Elira called this device her ghost in the machine. It was the only thing in the house that Alistair did not control. Every day, she waited for the right moment to hide it. She knew she had to be very careful. If Alistair found it, things would get much worse for her. Finally, one evening while he was busy in another part of the house, she tucked it deep inside her pillowcase where it could stay hidden but still hear everything. The first time she hit the record button, her hands were shaking so much she almost dropped it. She felt a mix of deep fear and a tiny spark of hope. For the first time in years, she wasn't just a victim, she was a witness. She lay back against the pillow, waiting for Alistair to enter the room. She knew he would come in soon to start his usual routine of insults and threats. As the door handle turned, Elira took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Alistair walked in, acting like the master of the house, completely unaware that a small machine was now catching every word he said. He thought he was alone with a woman who couldn't fight back, but the ghost was watching. This was the moment that changed everything. Elira was finally building the evidence that would one day show the world the true face of the man who lived in the Vance estate. Alistair walked into the bedroom, his heavy footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. He didn't look at Elira with kindness, he looked at her like a problem that needed to be solved. He sat at the edge of the bed and began to talk in a low, cold voice. Underneath the pillow, the small device captured every word of what Elira would later call audio file number 1. Alistair began to lecture her about how much money he was spending on her care. He called her a burden of excellence, a cruel joke about how his high standards were the only thing keeping her alive. He told her that she was charity and that without his family's name and wealth, the hospital would have given up on her long ago. His voice was calm, which made his words feel even more dangerous. "You think you're a doctor," he whispered harshly, mocking her past career. "You're nothing but an overweight little pig now. Nobody else would touch you. Nobody else would clean up after you." He laughed a dry, mean laugh that made Elira's skin crawl. He told her that she was a dirty zoo animal and that she should be grateful he hadn't left her in the street. Elira stayed perfectly still, her heart racing. She didn't argue or cry out because she knew the ghost was doing its job. For the first time, Alistair was saying these things while being recorded. He thought he was just breaking her spirit in private, but he was actually handing her the keys to her own prison. The recording was clear, catching every insult and every breath of his arrogance. As he finished his rant and stood up to leave, Elira felt a strange sense of power. She was no longer just a victim, she was a woman holding the evidence that would destroy the legend of Alistair Vance. The tension in the Vance house grew even more frightening on a dark Saturday night. Alistair entered the bedroom, but he didn't sit down this time. He stood over Elira, his shadow long and scary against the wall. He was furious because Elira had asked to see a different doctor. To Alistair, any attempt to get outside help was a threat to his control. Under the pillow, the recording device was still working, catching the sound of his heavy breathing and the anger in his voice. Alistair leaned down until his face was just inches from hers. He spoke in a whisper that was sharper than any shout. He told her that he was tired of her games and her complaining. Then, he made a terrifying threat that Elira would never forget. He told her that he knew exactly how to put her out of her misery without anyone ever knowing. He said he could make her swallow every morphine pill in her bottle, and she would be out of this world within 1 hour. As he spoke, he reached out and placed his hand near her neck. He told her that he could end her life right there by pressing on her jugular vein. "Do you hear me?" he hissed into the recorder. He wanted her to know that he held the power of life and death in his hands. Elira lay perfectly still, terrified that he might actually do it. She felt the coldness of his hand and the pure evil in his words. This Saturday night terror was the moment Elira realized that Alistair wasn't just mean, he was truly dangerous. He wasn't waiting for the cancer to take her, he was planning to do it himself. But even in her fear, she knew the recording was the most important thing she had. Alistair had just confessed to a plan to kill her. He thought he was showing his power, but he was actually giving the police the final proof they needed to take him away forever. One afternoon, the horror inside the house reached a level that Ilara could hardly believe. Because of her illness and the strong medicine she had to take, Ilara had a medical accident in the living room. She was embarrassed and needed help, but Alistair did not show her any kindness. Instead, he became colder than ever. Under the pillow in the nearby room, the recorder caught the sound of his angry footsteps and the harsh words that followed. Alistair went to the kitchen and grabbed a container of Clorox wipes. He didn't use them to gently clean the area. Instead, he grabbed Ilara roughly and began to rub the chemical wipes against her skin, ignoring her cries that it stung. He told her she was disgusting and repulsive. Then, in a moment of pure cruelty, he shoved the used, dirty wipes into her mouth. "He's going to make you swallow this," he hissed, speaking about himself in a scary way. "The dirty zoo animal you are." Ilara choked and tried to pull away, but she was too weak to fight him off. Alistair stood over her, watching her struggle, and told her that this was exactly what she deserved for being a burden to a man of his status. This was the Clorox incident, the moment where Ilara's human dignity was completely stripped away by the man who was supposed to be her caregiver. It was no longer just about angry words or threats, it was about physical torture. As Alistair finally walked away, leaving her gasping on the floor, Ilara knew she had to get out immediately. She also knew that the ghost in the machine had captured every sound of her struggle and every one of his hateful words. The proof of his evil was now undeniable, and it was only a matter of time before the world saw who Alistair Vance really was. While Ilara lay in her room, Alistair was already planning for a future without her. He knew that her cancer was very serious and that she might not have much time left. Instead of focusing on her comfort, he became obsessed with her money. There was a life insurance policy worth $1.3 million, and Alistair wanted to make sure every penny went to him. He began what Ilara called the beneficiary battle. He brought legal papers to her bedside and tried to force her to sign them while she was groggy from her pain medicine. He told her it was just paperwork to keep the estate safe, but Ilara knew he was trying to lock her into a deal that only helped him. When she moved too slowly or asked questions, his kindness would vanish instantly. Alistair used threats to get what he wanted. He told her that if she didn't sign the papers, he would stop paying for the special medicines that kept her pain away. He reminded her again that she was a burden and that she owed him this money for all the care he had given her. He even told her that if she died without signing, he would make sure she was buried in a place no one would ever visit. Under the pillow, the recording device captured the sound of the papers rustling in Alistair's mean, demanding voice. It recorded the way he bullied a dying woman just to get his hands on $1.3 million. Ilara felt like she was fighting for her life and her legacy at the same time. She realized that Alistair didn't just want her gone, he wanted to profit from her death. This greed made Ilara even more determined to make sure the police heard everything on that small machine. She wasn't just a patient anymore, she was a victim of a man who loved money more than he ever loved her. The house was very quiet as the clock ticked toward midnight. Ilara knew that Alistair was finally asleep in the other wing of the estate. She felt a strange mix of fear and strength as she reached for her walker. This was the moment she had been planning for weeks. With shaking hands, she pulled the secret recording device from her pillow and tucked it into her pocket. It was still running, capturing the soft sound of her breathing and the clink of her walker on the floor. Every step felt like she was carrying a heavy weight. Her legs were weak from the cancer, and her back hurt from the way Alistair had treated her. She moved slowly down the long, dark hallway, praying that the floor wouldn't creak. She reached the front door and leaned against the cold wood to catch her breath. She had managed to hide a small medical alert button earlier, and she pressed it now, hoping the signal would reach the help she needed. Minutes felt like hours as she waited by the door. Finally, she saw the blue and red lights of a police car reflecting off the marble walls. Ilara pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the cool night air. She saw the officers running toward her, their flashlights cutting through the dark. "I need help," she whispered as they reached her. "I need help out." She collapsed into their arms, feeling safe for the first time in years. As they lifted her into the ambulance, Ilara looked back at the big house one last time. She knew Alistair would wake up soon and try to tell his lies, but it didn't matter anymore. She had the recording, she had the police, and most importantly, she finally had her voice back. When the police returned to the Vance estate the next morning, Alistair was waiting for them. He stood in the driveway with his arms crossed, looking more annoyed than worried. He still wore his expensive clothes and used his old money voice to try and boss the officers around. He acted like Ilara's escape was a huge mistake and told the police they were wasting their time. "My wife is very sick," Alistair said with a fake sigh. "She doesn't know what she's saying. I've done everything for her." He was so arrogant that he even tried to show the officers his medical training certificates to prove he was a good guy. He believed that because he was rich and respected, the police would just take his word over hers. He stood there with a smug look on his face, waiting for them to apologize and leave his property. But the officers didn't leave. Instead, they asked him to step inside for a moment. They pulled out a small device, the same one Ilara had hidden under her pillow, and hit the play button. Suddenly, the air in the room changed. Alistair's own voice filled the hallway, calling Ilara names and threatening to end her life. The smug look on Alistair's face vanished instantly. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He realized that all his polished defenses and military-grade excuses were useless against his own recorded words. The evidence was right there, loud and clear. The officers didn't wait any longer. They told Alistair to turn around and put his hands behind his back. As the handcuffs clicked shut, the man who thought he was untouchable finally looked small. His arrogance had been his greatest strength, but now, it was the very thing that had trapped him. Alistair sat in the back of the police car, staring at the estate through the glass. He was still trying to think of a way out. He thought he could call his expensive lawyers and make the whole thing go away. He believed that Ilara was too weak and too scared to ever really stand up to him in court. But then, an officer opened the door and played another part of the file. The sound of the Clorox incident filled the car. Alistair heard himself hissing those awful words, calling his wife a zoo animal and laughing while she struggled to breathe. In that moment, the truth finally hit him like a physical blow. He realized that Ilara hadn't just told the police what happened, she had captured the monster he truly was. She had recorded everything. Every secret threat, every cold laugh, and every moment of pain he had caused was now saved on that tiny machine. His face turned pale, and for the first time, the old money mask completely fell away. He realized that his reputation was gone forever. The neighbors would hear these tapes. The doctors would know he was a liar. Even his own family would see the truth. He had spent years making sure Ilara felt small and powerless, but she had been the one with the power all along. He slumped back into the seat, his hands shaking in the metal cuffs. He had thought he was the smartest person in the room, but he had been outsmarted by a woman he called fragile. The silence in the car felt heavy. Alistair Vance, the man who thought he owned the world, finally understood that he was going to a place where his money and his name meant nothing. He was no longer a powerful husband, he was just a prisoner, caught by the voice of the woman he tried to silence. Ilara sat in a quiet room at the hospital. For the first time in years, she felt safe. The walls were white and clean, but they didn't feel like a prison. The nurses were gentle, and they didn't ask her to be grateful for their care. They just helped her. She knew her body was tired and that the cancer was winning the battle, but her spirit felt lighter than it had in a long time. She had done what she set out to do. She asked for one final meal. She didn't want the fancy, expensive food Alistair used to brag about. She just wanted something simple and peaceful. As she ate her last supper, she looked out the window at the trees. She knew she didn't have much time left, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had recorded the truth, and she knew that Alistair would never be able to hurt anyone else. Her family and friends, the people Alistair had pushed away, were finally allowed to visit her. They sat by her bed and held her hand. She told them how much she loved them and apologized for the long silence. They told her she was a hero. Ilara smiled, feeling a sense of peace that no amount of old money could ever buy. A few days later, Ilara passed away quietly in her sleep. She didn't die as a zoo animal or a burden, but as a brave woman who fought for her dignity. She died free from the shadows of the Vance estate. Her final act of peace was knowing that her voice would live on in those recordings. She had left the world a little bit better by making sure a monster was unmasked. Ilara Vance was finally at rest, and her legacy was one of strength, not shame. The courtroom was packed when Alistair Vance finally stood before the judge. He was no longer the powerful man in the expensive sweater, he looked tired and defeated. The prosecutor played the recordings one last time for the court. The sound of Alistair's cold voice filled the room, and people gasped when they heard the cruelty he had hidden behind his old money name. There was no way for him to lie his way out of it. The judge looked down at Alistair with a stern face. She spoke about how Alistair had used his position of trust to torture someone who was already suffering. She said that his military-grade care was actually a weapon used to hurt a woman who couldn't fight back. Because he had been so cold and had caused Ilara so much unnecessary pain, the judge handed down a sentence of 5 years in prison. Alistair stood frozen as the sentence was read. He realized that his legacy was truly gone. He would be remembered not as a successful businessman or a devoted husband, but as the man who was caught on tape being a monster. The money he had tried to steal through the insurance policy was taken away, and the Vance name was stained forever. As Alistair was led out of the courtroom in chains, Ilara's family felt a sense of relief. They knew that 5 years could never replace the life she lost, but it meant that justice had been served. Ilara had used her final moments to win a battle that seemed impossible. She had turned her weakness into a strength that brought a powerful man to his knees. The story of the evil husband ended with him behind bars, while Ilara's memory remained a symbol of courage and truth.